Margaret Johnson adjusted the strap of her handbag as she made her way into the cabin of Flight 287. Airplanes had always felt uncomfortably cold to her, but today was different. Excitement bubbled inside her. In just a few hours, she'd finally meet her first grandchild, a little girl born 2 weeks ago in New York. Her daughter Denise had sent photos that warmed her heart, yet nothing could rival the anticipation of holding that tiny life in her arms. She offered a smile to the flight attendant by the entrance, a young man who barely looked up as she passed. That was fine. She understood that everyone was busy. Her seat was in row 22, middle seat, not the best arrangement, but she considered it just part of the journey. Margaret carefully stowed her handbag under the seat in front of her, smoothing her blue dress as she did so. To her left sat a man absorbed in his laptop, oblivious to her presence, while to her right, an older woman glared intently at the armrest, her fingers tapping impatiently. Margaret folded her hands in her lap and exhaled softly. It was going to be a long flight, but it would be more than worth it. As passengers settled in, she noticed the crew weaving through the aisle. That's when she spotted her. Jennifer Collins, the blonde flight attendant. With sharp blue eyes, she moved briskly between rows, her demeanor conveying a sort of cold efficiency that Margaret found unsettling. There wasn't a genuine smile to be found on Jennifer's face. Margaret had flown enough to recognize forced politeness when she saw it. The attendant's movements felt robotic. She barely glanced at passengers while addressing their needs. When a woman requested help with her carry-on, Jennifer sighed audibly before begrudgingly assisting. A child behind Margaret accidentally kicked the seat in front of him, prompting Jennifer to shoot a glance so icy the boy immediately shrank against his mother, frightened to move. Margaret frowned. Something about Jennifer stirred memories of people who looked at her but never truly saw her. As the plane ascended smoothly and the scent of warm food filled the cabin an hour later, dinner service commenced. Margaret watched as Jennifer and the other attendants distributed trays swiftly down the aisle, the clatter of plastic trays punctuating the air. When Jennifer finally reached her row, she placed a tray in front of the businessman beside her, then another in front of the impatient woman to her right, but skipped over Margaret entirely. Margaret blinked in disbelief. Surely it was a mistake. She waited, expecting the attendant to come back and correct it, but Jennifer had already moved on to the next row. A knot tightened in Margaret's stomach. This couldn't be right. She cleared her throat, raised her hand slightly, and called out, "Excuse me, miss," her voice steady but firm. Jennifer turned, her expression flat, revealing no hint of amusement. "Yes, I think I was missed. I didn't get my meal." Jennifer's lips tightened into a thin line. "We're out of meals," she replied curtly. Margaret frowned in response. She glanced down the aisle, seeing trays still being handed out. "It looks like there are still meals being served," Margaret said, maintaining her politeness despite her confusion. Maybe it was just an oversight. Jennifer's body tensed, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. "As I mentioned, we don't have any available," she stated, her voice sharp and final. "You should have asked earlier." Margaret felt her breath hitch. Asking earlier wasn't an option. The service had just made it to her row. She turned slightly and noticed that the businessman beside her was watching intently, as was the woman to her right. The couple across the aisle had stopped their conversation, and eyes were now on her. Margaret's fingers gripped the fabric of her dress. Years of experience had taught her when to let things slide, but this felt different. "I don't mean to be difficult," Margaret began, carefully selecting her words, "but I didn't have the chance to ask sooner. You were serving meals, and I was waiting for my turn." Jennifer released an exasperated breath, looking at Margaret as if she were a child who didn't grasp the rules. "The airline's policy doesn't guarantee meals for every passenger," she stated, her words hanging in the air like a reprimand. Margaret felt the scrutiny of dozens of eyes upon her. She wasn't trying to be rude, nor was she raising her voice. Yet a wave of humiliation washed over her, seeping into her skin like an unwelcome warmth. "I see," she murmured, shifting in her seat and suddenly feeling small. Just then, a voice sliced through the tension. "That's not true." Margaret turned, along with several other passengers, to see Michael Thompson, the man seated across the aisle. He was in his late 40s, wearing a button-down shirt with rolled sleeves. His jaw set tightly, dark brown eyes locked onto Jennifer. "I saw you take extra trays from the galley just a few minutes ago." He continued, his tone calm yet pointed. "There are meals available." Jennifer froze, the first crack appearing in her icy demeanor. "I'm sorry, sir, but that's not your concern," she replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Michael leaned back slightly, tilting his head in quiet defiance. It's in those moments when I witness someone being treated unjustly that everything shifts. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. Passengers exchanged curious glances, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Margaret felt a tightness in her throat. She was never one to seek the spotlight. Being the focus of attention was the last thing she desired. Yet, a part of her was compelled to watch. Jennifer's gaze darted toward Robert Anderson, the chief flight attendant, who was approaching their row with purpose. "Is there a problem here?" he inquired, his tone a mixture of professionalism and authority. Jennifer paused, hesitant. "No, sir. I was just explaining to this passenger that we don't have any extra meals." Robert's eyes moved between Margaret, Michael, and Jennifer, his brow knitting together in concern. "Jennifer, can I have a word with you?" Jennifer's cheeks flared with embarrassment as Robert signaled for her to follow him to the galley. The other passengers remained attentive. Margaret stayed motionless, her stomach churning, not from hunger, but from a familiar, unsettling sensation. She'd seen this type of dismissal before, the way people sometimes regarded her as insignificant, their attention wavering from her words. But not today. Jennifer's heels echoed against the floor as she followed Robert, her face aflame with color. Her jaw tensed as whispers buzzed among the passengers, spreading like a wildfire through the cabin. Margaret felt frozen in place, still grappling with what had just transpired. Her hands trembled gently in her lap, but she willed herself to stay composed. She wouldn't let this rattle her. Not in front of them. Michael Thompson, the lawyer who had spoken out, turned to her. "Are you okay?" he asked. Margaret nodded quietly. Before she could respond, a woman 2 rows ahead leaned back. "That was really messed up," she said, shaking her head. "There was no reason for her to skip you like that." Margaret swallowed hard. "I just wanted to eat like everyone else." "And you should," Michael replied, his voice heavy with unspoken implications. The businessman beside Margaret finally shut his laptop, stroking his chin as if weighing whether to intervene. "I fly Sky Airways all the time, and I've never seen a flight attendant refuse service like that." Michael released a breath, his fingers tapping restlessly against the armrest. "Unfortunately, I have, and I'm willing to bet this isn't the first time she's done it." Margaret's stomach twisted at his words. She had spent years trying to convince herself that things had improved since then. The world had shifted, and she thought that as long as she maintained her composure, staying polite, calm, and dignified, she could avoid situations like this. Yet here she was, cramped into a seat 30,000 feet in the air, feeling that same old invisible burden of being seen but not acknowledged. The galley curtain swayed, and Jennifer emerged once more. Her body was rigid, and while her expression was carefully blank, there was a distinct tenseness around her lips. She moved past the rows, deliberately avoiding Margaret's gaze and anyone else's, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Passengers turned to watch her, forming their judgments and memories. Moments later, Robert appeared, balancing a tray in his hands. Margaret's breath hitched as he paused next to her seat. He lowered himself slightly, his voice softer than it had been. "Ms. Johnson, I'd like to personally apologize on behalf of Sky Airways," he said, gently placing the tray on her outstretched table. "It turns out there was, in fact, a meal available for you." The significance of the moment pressed heavily against Margaret's chest. His words felt like a stone settling in her stomach. It wasn't a mere oversight. Though Robert's demeanor was professional, a deeper understanding flickered in his eyes. Margaret exhaled slowly. "Thank you." She reached for the plastic fork, attempting to ignore the stares that lingered on her. Jennifer strode past them again, vanishing toward the front of the plane. Whispers fluttered behind closed hands as Michael let out a sigh, shaking his head. That's not enough, he said with urgency. Margaret turned to him, fork-paused midair. What do you mean? She asked, confused. She humiliated you in front of everyone. If Robert hadn't intervened, she would have gotten away with it. Margaret pressed her lips tight, understanding the truth in his words. This wasn't solely about the meal, yet a part of her hesitated. Would drawing attention to it only make things worse? Michael seemed to sense her internal struggle. You don't have to address it if you're not ready, he said softly. But this isn't just about you. If she's treated others like this before, she'll do it again. Margaret's eyes dropped to her tray. Her appetite had vanished. Deep down, she recognized he was right. And she wasn't alone in her feelings. A man 3 rows back raised his phone, capturing the scene. He hadn't recorded anything before, but now he was recording, whispering to the woman next to him, who responded with a nod. Another passenger, a young woman with curly hair, was typing rapidly on her phone. Margaret glanced at her screen and caught a glimpse of a tweet being drafted. Her name didn't appear in the post, but the message was unmistakable. A Sky Airways flight attendant refused to serve an elderly black woman, claiming the meals ran out while dishing out plates to the white passengers sitting right next to her. It was infuriating. Margaret swallowed hard. The woman clicked post. A sharp exhale escaped Margaret's lips. She didn't want this to escalate into a spectacle. Michael tilted his head slightly. It already is, he pointed out. She briefly closed her eyes, realizing he was right. The moment Jennifer had denied that woman her meal, she understood this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. Margaret had spent her entire life shrinking back to avoid situations like this. But now she felt powerless. The hum of the plane filled the air as time crawled forward. Passengers and flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, but the tension lingered. Then Jennifer came back into view. She'd been gone too long. Her demeanor seemed tense, her movements rigid. She was approaching Robert. Margaret watched as Jennifer leaned in, whispering something to him. Robert's face remained unchanged, but the grip on the manifest he held tightened. With a sigh, he nodded toward the galley. Jennifer hesitated momentarily, but then, shoulders squared, she turned and walked away. Margaret had no idea what had just transpired, but she sensed a change in the atmosphere. Michael leaned in closer. Did you see that? He asked. Margaret nodded slowly. She's nervous. She should be, he added quietly. A ding sounded overhead, signaling the pilot's voice over the intercom as he gave an update on their arrival time. Margaret tried to focus on the announcement, but her thoughts drifted elsewhere. Caught between her empty stomach, the tightness in Jennifer's expression, and the quiet murmurs of passengers who wouldn't forget what they had witnessed, Margaret felt the wheels of something larger already in motion. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure she wanted to halt the progress. Jennifer had vanished again. Nearly 40 minutes had passed since Margaret last saw her walk down the aisle, and the passengers were taking note. Margaret was aware. Michael Thompson settled back into his seat, arms crossed, his eyes darting toward the front of the plane, where the flight attendants congregated near the galley. Something was definitely stirring. Margaret sat untouched by her meal, the heaviness from earlier incidents weighing down her chest. Across the aisle, the woman who had tweeted about the situation was speaking softly to another passenger. Occasionally, she would glance at her phone and then at Margaret, her fingers flying over the screen. Margaret felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She didn't have to guess. The news was already spreading. Then, the chief flight attendant, Robert Anderson, emerged from the front. His expression was inscrutable, but his stride was steady. Jennifer followed closely behind, looking pale and rigid, her hands clasped tightly as if preparing for something unpleasant. Stopping near Margaret's row, Robert surveyed the passengers before clearing his throat. When he finally spoke, his tone was carefully measured, yet it carried a serious undertone. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take a moment to address what happened earlier. An immediate silence enveloped the cabin. Drinks were set down, chairs turned, and all attention shifted to Robert. Jennifer stared ahead, her jaw clenched in a way that hinted at her distress. Robert drew in a slow breath. We take these matters very seriously. Margaret's grip on the armrest tightened involuntarily. Zero tolerance. Since when was this a priority? As Robert turned towards Jennifer, a small crack appeared in her composed facade. This isn't the first time, is it? Robert's voice was low, slicing through the silence like a knife. A soft murmur rippled through the cabin as Jennifer flinched and Margaret's breath hitched. Michael leaned forward, his eyes glued to the tense scene unfolding. Jennifer's nostrils flared, her fingers twitching nervously. I don't know what you're talking about, she insisted, but Robert's expression hardened. I do, he replied firmly, and so does the airline. Margaret felt the air shift around her, the moment of truth lurking just beneath the surface. Turning slightly, Robert began addressing the passengers with a tone that commanded respect. I've worked for this airline for over 15 years, he stated, and I regret to inform you that this is not the first time I've received complaints about Miss Collins. Margaret's stomach sank as the gravity of the situation settled in. She wasn't the first, nor would she be the last. A sense of dread filled the cabin. Passengers murmured anxiously amongst themselves, some inching closer, white-knuckled armrests their only anchor. The heat flushed Jennifer's cheeks. This isn't the time or place, someone said, but Robert's interruption was sharp. It matters because this keeps happening. The cabin fell into a heavy silence, pregnant with tension. Margaret's hands shook. She had braced herself for an apology, perhaps an awkward justification, but instead, Michael let out a low whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. Damn, he muttered quietly. Robert's voice remained steady. In the past year, several passengers have lodged complaints against Miss Collins for similar actions. Each complaint was recorded, yet no significant measures were taken. Margaret's stomach churned. No real action meant the airline was aware of the issue, that they had let her continue with this behavior. Jennifer's nails dug into her palm. This is ridiculous. Her tone was sharp and defensive. I was just following the policy. If people were offended, that's on them. Margaret felt a jagged pain in her chest. Jennifer's voice was void of remorse. No accountability. Robert didn't respond to her words. Instead, he withdrew a small notepad from his pocket. He flipped through its pages, then began reading. Flight 142, December. A black passenger in first class was denied a meal upgrade, even though it was available. Flight 226, March. A Hispanic mother with a toddler was refused extra water, while others received multiple bottles. Flight 319, July. An elderly Asian man was repeatedly overlooked when asking for help with his seat. Margaret's heart raced. Michael breathed out a stunned Jesus. All eyes were on Jennifer now. Jennifer's breath hitched in her throat. She opened her mouth, hesitated, and then shut it again. Robert snapped the notepad shut, his gaze fixed on her. I think we've heard enough, he declared, the finality of his words hanging in the air. Jennifer's chest heaved with quick breaths, her posture tense as she shot back, You can't do this. You can't just. I can. Robert interrupted smoothly. Margaret braced herself for what was coming. The moment had arrived. Robert squared his shoulders, delivering the crushing news with cold precision. Effective immediately, Ms. Collins, you are relieved of duty for this flight. When we land in New York, HR will be waiting for you. A visible tension rippled through Jennifer, her body going rigid. Wait, she exclaimed in disbelief. You can either comply, Robert continued, his tone steely, or I will arrange for security to escort you off the aircraft upon landing. Gasps and murmurs swept across the cabin, and someone in the back even clapped. Jennifer's eyes darted around in desperation, searching for a sympathetic face. There was none. Her expression fell apart, not from regret, but from sheer humiliation. Margaret observed closely as the weight of reality crashed over Jennifer. This was the moment she had dreaded. Jennifer was no longer in control. She was the one being dismissed. Margaret exhaled slowly. For years, she had told herself that survival meant putting up with it all. But today, she felt seen. And for the first time, Justice was unfolding at 30,000 feet. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted markedly. The polite chatter had succumbed to an electric tension. Passengers exchanged furtive glances, their eyes flitting between Jennifer, who had turned rigid by the galley, and Robert, who had just publicly stripped her of her power. Margaret sat motionless, hands clasped in her lap, the gravity of the moment pressing down on her. She had spent countless years sidestepping scenarios like this. Yet here she was, right in the thick of it. Jennifer's breaths were shallow, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She opened her mouth again, only to close it, fists clenching at her sides. Margaret braced herself for a surge of anger, a sharp comeback, or an emotional outburst. But what she witnessed instead was something far more unsettling. Fear etched across Jennifer's face. Turning to Robert, Jennifer's voice dropped, almost imploring. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," he cut in, his firmness edged with a hint of compassion. "And so do they." He gestured toward the watching passengers, dozens of eyes locked onto Jennifer, scrutinizing her every move. Her throat tightened as she forced down a lump. "You don't have the authority to fire me mid-flight." Robert's expression remained steady, unyielding. "I don't have that power, but I can officially take you off active duty, which means you'll be a passenger for this flight. When we land, HR will take it from there." Jennifer inhaled sharply, her grip on her uniform tightening. Passengers began to whisper, approval echoing in hushed tones throughout the cabin. "She had it coming," one voice said. "Should have happened long ago," someone else added. Margaret's heart raced. This was real. For once, Jennifer wasn't going to walk away without consequences. Jennifer finally faced Margaret, their eyes locking. For a fleeting moment, Margaret caught a glimpse of something raw and desperate in Jennifer's gaze. But just as quickly it vanished, Jennifer straightened up, smoothing her uniform as if to assert her control once again. With a sharp turn, she strode into the crew-only area at the front of the plane. An uncomfortable silence enveloped the cabin until a slow clap broke it. Margaret turned, surprised. A man 2 rows back started clapping, once, then twice, and soon the entire cabin joined in. Applause surged like a wave of validation that caught Margaret off guard. Her cheeks flushed with a mix of embarrassment and an overwhelming sense of relief. For once, she wasn't invisible. Not today. Michael leaned closer, a smirk playing on his lips. "Guess you made an impact." Margaret let out a shaky laugh. "I didn't do anything." He shook his head. "You just existed." And that alone was enough. She swallowed hard, glancing down at her hands. For the first time since boarding, they were steady. 30 minutes later, the flight carried on, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Passengers whispered among themselves, fingers flying over their phones, while others stole glances toward the front, waiting for Jennifer to return. But she didn't. Margaret tried to settle back into her seat, but restlessness gnawed at her. She had spent years training herself to let things go. But this time, she didn't want to forget. She exhaled slowly, looking at Michael. "What happens now?" Michael sighed, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Sky Airways will likely want to keep this quiet, issue a statement, fire Jennifer, and then act like nothing occurred." Margaret frowned, conflicted. "And if I want this to be known?" Michael's expression flickered with admiration. "Then you make sure it doesn't fade away." Margaret mulled over his words. She had never considered herself the seeker of justice. Surviving had always been her focus. But maybe it was time for more than mere survival. Up front, Jennifer was slumped in a crew seat, arms crossed tightly, her gaze unfocused on the wall. Inside, her thoughts were racing. She sensed the murmurs from the passengers around her, fully aware of their judgments. Everything she had worked tirelessly to build was on the brink of crumbling. All because of one elderly woman. Jennifer clenched her jaw, her breath hitching. Thoughts of arguing, fighting back, or even suing the airline for wrongful termination surged through her. Yet in her heart, she understood the harsh reality. Everything had been recorded. The narrative was already gaining momentum. Jennifer Collins had been unmasked, and there was nothing left for her to do but brace for the fallout. As the plane touched down in New York with a gentle thud, the tension inside lingered like a thick fog. Passengers immediately whipped out their phones, desperate for updates. Margaret took a deep breath, her gaze fixed out the window. New York. She should have felt a thrill at the sight. Thoughts of her granddaughter should have danced in her mind. Instead, her thoughts spiraled into uncertainty. What would Sky Airways do next? Would they issue an apology? Would they attempt to bury this incident? Would Jennifer fade into obscurity, only to land another job elsewhere? Margaret had no answers. But one thing was clear. Silence wasn't an option. As the crowd began to form by the gate, Margaret noticed a few sharply dressed men standing off to the side. HR representatives from Sky Airways, waiting, observing. Jennifer stepped off the plane, tense and expressionless. Margaret trailed closely behind, heart racing at the unfolding drama. One of the HR reps approached. "Ms. Collins, please come with us." Jennifer's hands curled into fists at her sides. It was the end of her career. Margaret stayed rooted in place, watching her disappear down the corridor. She should have felt a sense of triumph. But fatigue washed over her instead. Michael approached, hands tucked into his pockets. "You okay?" Margaret exhaled slowly, uncertainty flooding her thoughts. "I'm not sure." Michael gave a slow nod. "If you ever consider legal action, here's my card." Margaret blinked, taken aback. Legal action? Michael's smile was subdued. While Jennifer might be facing consequences, Sky Airways had allowed her to behave this way for far too long. He shrugged. "You have a case." Margaret's gaze fixated on the business card cradled in her hands. A case for once. Surprisingly, the thought didn't alarm her. She met Michael's eyes. "I'll think about it," he responded with a smile. "Good." Margaret slipped the card into her purse, her gaze lingering toward the hallway where Jennifer had vanished. The battle wasn't over, but this time she felt ready. Seated in her daughter's living room, she warmed her hands around a cup of tea. Outside, the gentle hum of New York City flowed through the apartment window, mingled with distant car horns and snippets of laughter from passersby. It had been 4 days since the flight, 4 days since her life had unknowingly represented something larger. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, flickering to life with a steady stream of messages, emails, and notifications. People from across the nation had reached out, some offering support, others sharing their own stories of discrimination, and some simply saying, "I saw what happened. I'm sorry. I believe you." Margaret had never anticipated any of this. For decades, she had endured, kept her head down, and sidestepped confrontation. But now her name popped up in news segments. Her story had circulated thousands of times online, and Sky Airways was in damage control. She took a slow sip of tea, casting her eyes toward the television. The news ticker scrolled across the screen. Sky Airways announces new anti-discrimination training following viral incident on Flight 287. She pressed her lips together. Training. That's what they termed it, a carefully crafted PR strategy to silence the uproar. Jennifer's name was absent from the conversation. But Margaret understood the truth. Jennifer had been allowed to escape accountability for years, and no training course could rectify that. A soft cry echoed from the hallway, pulling her from her thoughts. Denise appeared, gently cradling a small bundle in her arms. "She just woke up," her daughter said, fatigue lacing her voice. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her as she reached out, carefully taking the baby. She gazed down at the tiny, perfect fingers and the soft curls that had just begun to form on the baby's head. Her granddaughter, the reason she had boarded that flight in the first place. Margaret swallowed hard. She had pondered deeply about what kind of world this child would inherit. And for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that maybe she had made a difference, even if just a little. Denise sat next to her, her gaze fixed intently on her mother. "You've been quiet," she observed. "Are you okay?" Margaret hesitated but managed to nod. "Just thinking." Denise narrowed her eyes in concentration. "About what happened?" Margaret let out a deep breath. "Part of me wonders if I should have just let it go." Denise frowned. "Mama," she said gently, as Margaret shook her head. I've spent my whole life trying to dodge moments like that, trying to be polite, to avoid giving others a reason to treat me differently. She glanced down at the baby cradled in her arms. But it never mattered, did it? Denise squeezed her mother's hand, a reassuring gesture. It mattered this time. Margaret felt a lump in her throat as she blinked back unexpected tears. Because Denise was right. It did matter. And for the first time, Margaret felt truly heard. Meanwhile, Jennifer Collins sat in a rundown diner, her hands clutching a coffee cup that remained untouched. Her career had unraveled. The airline had fired her a mere day after they landed in New York. HR had shown no mercy, no negotiation, no severance package, no letter of recommendation. Just a termination letter and a signed NDA that offered no cover for the truth everyone had already figured out. She was now considered a liability. Jennifer gritted her teeth, scrolling through her phone in frustration. She had attempted to erase her social media presence, but it was futile. The damage was done. People had their screenshots, videos, and receipts. Her name was already tainted. For years, she had navigated life unscathed, aware she could skirt past small wrongs, knowing that individuals like Margaret Johnson rarely caused disruptions. But now she had lost. And the weight of that loss rested entirely on her shoulders. Jennifer gripped her coffee cup so tightly her knuckles turned pale. She wanted to see herself as a victim, but a nagging part of her recognized the hard truth, and that realization would linger with her for a long time to come. 1 week later, Margaret found herself sitting across from Michael Thompson at a quiet cafe, a folder resting between them. I think you have a strong case, Michael said, taking a sip of his coffee. Sky Airways ignored multiple complaints against Jennifer. That's negligence. Margaret hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. Do I really want to fight this? She murmured. Do I have the energy for it? Michael regarded her closely. That's your decision. Margaret took a deep breath. She felt exhausted. But she realized that if she didn't take action, if she didn't hold the airline accountable, then someone else might find themselves in her position one day, experiencing the same humiliation she had faced. She straightened her back. I'll do it. Michael nodded, a slight smile spreading across his face. Good choice. Margaret took the pen and signed her name at the bottom of the page. She had spent far too much time being silent, but that was about to change.